first responders come onto the scene and they come to take care of him, and they begin to argue and to discuss with one another how exactly they're going to figure out how to extricate this man from the deep hole that he fell into. Fell into a rut. How are they going to get him out? So after a very difficult rescue, they immediately begin to apply to him hot and cold, both hot and cold compresses. They start to put different size gauze pads on him and all sorts of bandages. This one's putting ointments on him, and the other one is putting antiseptics, and they're making sure that he's all healthy. And they're trying to take care of all the scratches and all the bruises that he has all over his body. Suddenly, a highly skilled cardiologist shows up on the scene, and after spending about 10 to 15 seconds surveying what's going on, he begins to yell at all of these first responders. He says, "What's wrong with all of you? I don't understand. Can you guys see that this man is hardly breathing? Has nobody noticed that he doesn't even have a heart rate? He doesn't have a pulse anymore? What are you sitting here putting bandages on him, and you're putting ointments and all sorts of creams and antiseptics and gauze pads? Don't you realize what the man really needs is CPR? He's lost his life. He's practically not breathing anymore. Why don't we first pay attention to that, and then later we'll figure out how to deal with all these other side issues." So it's pretty much, we would agree that this is a nonsensical, pretty pathetic scene. But in truth, the Chidah writes in one of his Svarim that this is really the experience when we consider the balance of our own lives. This is really in many ways the experience that we all share together. The Chidah in his Sefer Chomas Hadas writes that we all have our own personal potholes. We all have our own very deeply troubling personal trenches that we fall into. And we all have those ditches that sometimes we find ourselves trying to crawl out of. We have what the Chidah himself calls Pitzaim be'evari hanefesh. We have wounds which hurt us not on our physical bodies, but they hurt us at our core, they hurt us at our spiritual essence. And we're injured, and we're hurt, and we're bruised, and we're banged up, and we're scratched. And the Chidah writes that we all have that moment when we personally begin to try to move toward that rescue, to try to extricate ourselves from the terrible pit, from the terrible trenches that we have fallen into. For some of us, that begins already on Rosh Chodesh Elul. When we start to hear the first soundings of the shofar, shake some of us up. For other people, obviously, it happens on Rosh Hashanah perhaps. Maybe when we say the words mi yichya, mi yamos, maybe that makes us start to think about how we're going to get ourselves out. For others, perhaps, it waits, Shabbos Shuvah, or maybe to some deeply inspiring moment in the middle of Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur. And whenever that time is when we begin to feel the need to extricate ourselves, we somehow begin to flutter and we begin to scramble around for all kinds of things that we think, that we feel will help us rehabilitate ourselves. For some people it means they'll pay an exorbitant amount of money to have somebody daven 40 days at the kotel for them. Or we'll pay someone a lot of money to go to Uman and give a special prayer for us and our families. Or perhaps we'll have a group of women who come together to be mafresh challah because you need a minyan, because you need a certain amount of people who are going to do it together to make the special, significant hafrashas challah actually worthwhile. Or maybe we start to say Parak Shira or Pitam Aktores, or we have all sorts of things to look for that will get us out of to heal our little scratches and our bruises here and our things that we have over there. We first have to make sure to get our heart rate. We have to get ourselves pulsating again. That's the only way to begin this process of extricating ourselves from the places we've fallen into. Eitz Chaim Hila Machazikima. What greater place to talk about this than a yeshiva? Ki hu chayechem ve'orach yamechem, where the Torah tells us, this is your life. This is more essential and more important than anything else, is our need to recommit ourselves, to reconnect ourselves, to reinvest of ourselves to every detail of the Ribono Shel Olam's Torah. to remind ourselves that we need to have a rededication of our lives and our efforts, to make sure to follow each and every mitzvah, to understand each and every mitzvah, to keep and to follow each and every mitzvah, and to that endless pursuit of trying to master and study the precious Torah itself. Ki hu chayechem ve'orech yameichem. That is what will give us back our pulse before anything else. That's the most basic, the most central component to our collective process of rehabilitation, is to reestablish our own heartbeat, to make sure that we're ready to have a vigorous commitment to everything that the Ribono Shel Olam's Torah actually stands for. And without that critical step, we are like that man, says the Chidah, who has the pitzaim be'evarei haguf, who has those bruises, terribly injured, all over his body. And they're sitting and trying to bandage him up, when meanwhile his respiratory organs have already collapsed and stopped functioning. This is our life, this is our obligation, and this is the most critical thing we need to think about. Ki hu chayechem ve'orech yameichem. If you ever read stories about previous generations when they describe what exactly the experience was like of Yamim Noraim in the shuls and the communities and the shtibels of the days of our ancestors. And it would seem, from reading the stories, from what they say, it would seem that a person used to hear various individuals pouring their hearts out. And I don't know about you, but when I go to shul nowadays, and I believe probably most of us who go to shul on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, don't find that we have the same experience. If we're lucky, we get through most of the words that we're supposed to say. We might even try to flip the pages at the same time as the chazan is. We try to do our best to bang our chest to get all the al-chetzin, try to say all the yashamnus properly. But we very rarely hear people who really are crying out and are screaming in the middle of davening. We rarely hear people who give us that sense of urgency that the davening is supposed to give us and supposed to make us feel. And I once heard in the name of Rabbi Lopian, Rav Asher Weiss shared this idea with me from Rabbi Lopian, that the reason for this might be that if you can picture for a moment the scene of a very hungry and ferocious wolf that's going to eat some sort of very gentle and innocent sheep out there in the wilderness. When the wolf goes and attacks the sheep on the extremities or on the back legs of the animal, the sheep can obviously try to save itself by crying out to others, by screaming out into the wilderness. Maybe some other animal will come to its rescue. Maybe someone else will step forth and actually save this sheep from this terrifying scene that will unfold. But imagine, if you have a wolf, a hungry, a ferocious wolf, that does not bite at the extremities, but rather bites the sheep at its neck or at its throat, at the makom shanashama tluyaba. Imagine the wolf comes and bites the sheep right at its neck, right at its core, at the place where there's no longer the ability for that sheep, for that gentle, for that innocent sheep of no return. That's the time when the sheep feels helpless and nothing. So Rav Lopian suggested that in essence this is the story of our generation, of the Yeridas Hadoros. And he suggested that we live in an age where the Yetzer Hara, where the evil inclination, where all the temptation that surrounds us is so overly illusory. It's so incredibly vile. It's so outrageous when you think about it. How great the temptations are. And the Yetzer Hara, all this around us, stops nothing short of actually trying to strangle us at our makom shehanashama tluyaba. He doesn't get us at our legs. He literally gets us at our neck. That we almost have no way of even crying out anymore. And perhaps, explain Rabbi Lopian, perhaps this is why on the Yom Noraim, it's not that we're not interested. It's not that we're apathetic. It's not that we don't care, or because we're overly callous about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with the Borei Olam. That's not the reason why we don't hear people crying out. Of course we care. But rather it's because we're practically suffocating from the unbelievable difficulties, from the challenges that this world presents us with. That's perhaps why, said Rabbi Lapian, we don't hear people feeling that intensity or expressing it the way they used to. It's not because we don't care, but it's because we don't have the ability to, because we're somewhat strangled by everything that's happening around us. One of the highlights of our davening during this season, I think, is undoubtedly the paragraph of Unesana Tokef. And everyone gets very emotionally attached to this paragraph, to this saying that we all recite on Musaf of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And part of that paragraph we say, V'chol boi olam yavrun lefanecha kivnei maron. Loosely translated, I guess it means that all living inhabitants of this world will pass before you, the Ribbon Shalom, will pass before you, God, in judgment. Like the sheep who are counted by their master, by the farmer, in order to figure out which one is going to be designated for Meiser, which one is going to be given away from the rest of the herd, from the rest of the sheep. That is the same way, Kol boi olam yavrin lefanecha kivnei maron. That's the way the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah explains this small passage that we say in Musaf. The Meshech Chochmah suggests that during this process, when the farmer is counting through his sheep to figure out which one is going to be Meiser, so each and every variation, every diverse strain of sheep pass through the very same threshold and are counted all as one. We don't make a separate count for the different kinds of sheep. Explains the Meshech Chochmah. You have the sheep, it doesn't matter if they're black, if they're white, if they're brown. It doesn't matter if they're spotted or if they are solid colored. It doesn't make a difference if they're mature, overly developed, or if they're very young and newborn, infant stage sheep. All of them pass through there, all included in one communal count, and they all pass through that narrow opening at the threshold of the field where the farmer stands there with his stick. And says the Meshech Chochmah, the same happens on Rosh Hashanah, the same happens in this period of year, when we all go through that inspection process, when our master, when our farmer, so to speak, Kavayachal, actually stands there and passes through, lets the entire world pass through like sheep. And it doesn't make a difference what our personal accomplishments might be, what our backgrounds, our experiences are, how educated we might be, what we think our qualifications are, where we went to school, and how good or poorly we davened or learned. Everybody's going to pass through there. The very narrow path. Everyone's going to be equally scrutinized. Everyone is going to be equally looked at. Everyone is going to be equally investigated, and it doesn't make a difference what we look like or what our background might be. But what is not well known, explains the Meshech Chochmah, is that there's one halacha when we talk about the farmer counting the Meiser that would completely invalidate the entire count. When the farmer's counting through all the sheep, when he's trying to figure out which one is going to be designated for the Meiser, says the Meshech Chochmah, there is one halacha that many of us are not aware of that would invalidate the entire counting that the farmer has spent so much time doing. And that is, if we include an animal, mishana zu al shel chaverta. That is, if we take a sheep that was born to a previous year's crop and include it into this year's count, the whole count is over. Explains our Meir Simcha the Meshech Chochmah, the one and only thing that both the Ribbon Shalom and us ourselves cannot do during this process, during this inspection that we go through each and every year. And when we think about ourselves and examine everything that we've done, everything's okay to look at. But the one and only thing that would invalidate our own introspection, the one and only thing that would ruin this entire process would be to think about Mishana zu al shel chaverta. If we measure ourselves up to the greats of previous generations, to look at ourselves as if we're unworthy and undeserving because of the lofty spiritual levels that our ancestors may have reached in generations way before us. That, says the Meshech Chochmah, is an inappropriate way for us to think. When we talk about Kol boi olam yavrun lefanecha kivnei maron, we have to remind ourselves also that mishana zu al shel chaverta invalidates a count. We cannot look at ourselves in the context of previous generations because they're not living in our times and we are not living in theirs. They did not experience our challenges. They didn't live through the life and times that we do, and we don't live through the ones like they did. We don't have giants like previous generations. We don't have a Vilna Gaon or a Rabbi Akiva Eger, a Minchas Chinuch, a Shach. We don't have all these people. We don't have incredible personalities like previous generations had, but at the same time, none of those great people, none of those Gedolim that we mentioned, lived with the unbelievable explosion of technology. And none of them had the overwhelming power and the seductive nature of social media. And none of them had the irresistible temptation or the incredible addiction that our generation has to the internet. None of them had these experiences. And therefore we cannot measure ourselves to their standards, because they're not living in our times and we are not living in theirs. It's unreasonable, it's almost absurd, says the Meshech Chachma, for us to compare ourselves to them. Like the Chida and Rav Elia Lapian describe so beautifully, we live in a time where the evil inclination that surrounds us has literally bit us by the neck, literally come to us at our throats. The wolf has attacked us not at our extremities, but literally. He has tried to take away the faint Jewish heartbeat that we're all supposed to have. And our job is first and foremost to bring that back, to revive it, to once again make it active, to make sure it's vibrant, to make it once again energetic, and to make sure it is pulsating stronger than ever before. Ki hu chayechem ve'orech yamechem. Our first line of business is to connect ourselves with the Torah itself, to recommit ourselves to every mitzvah that is found in the pages of the Torah, and to understand that that is the lifeline, that is the most critical component of our getting ourselves out of these pits that we have fallen into. The Medrash writes that Klal Yisrael is nimshelu legefen. Klal Yisrael are compared to the vineyard. And what does that mean? Many Mefarshim explain that what it means is on a vineyard you have very young and blossoming fruit. You have beautiful grapes that are growing. But what are they sustained by? What do they live on? A dead and a lifeless stick that actually has no vibrancy of its own. All the grapes just surround this stick, and somehow they grow from it. But the stick itself doesn't have any vitality, doesn't have any life. And in our time, more so than ever before, we invoke and we advocate for our schus avos as well. We ask that our lifeless ancestors who are no longer with us, all the generations that came before us, we ask that they buttress the same way that stick is able to uphold the vineyard. We ask that all of them uphold. We ask that they advocate for us. And we ask that they allow their young vineyards, their young beautiful fruit, to progress and to make positive strides in the world that is so complicated and so difficult, to the world that's so deceptive, to the world that's so dishonest that we all live in. Schus avos, as we know, is a very important concept. It's something that the Jewish people talk about all the time, but it should not be confused with this idea of mishana zu al shel chaverta. We are never expected to measure up to our ancestors, and we are never going to be judged by them either, because they lived, as we said, a very different experience than we do, and we live a very different experience than they did. The only thing that we are asked to do is to measure up to ourselves, is to meet that wholesome individual that we were destined to become. To make sure that we look inside of ourselves, instead of looking up to previous generations, look at ourselves and our children. Look at the place where we want our grandchildren to be. And that's who we should be measuring ourselves up to. Those are the choices that we need to make. Those are the decisions that we are faced with. And those are the challenges that our generation deals with all the time. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says the very famous story that many of us talk about at this time of year. But I just want to share a very different perspective on this very famous story. The Gemara talks about Rebbe Elazar ben Durdaya, and in the beginning of time, he really was known not as Rebbe Elazar ben Durdaya. He was known as simple man, or less than that, Elazar ben Durdaya, who spent his whole life, years and years, involved in decadence and immorality. He was involved in the most disgraceful acts, as we know, the Gemara tells us, and after realizing how far off track his life had taken him, he finally begins to consider, maybe it's a good idea to become a Baal Tshuva. Maybe it's a good idea to reconsider everything I've done in my life. And the Gemara goes on to tell us that he cried the most sincere and the most heartfelt tefillos, and he poured his heart out, and he felt such deep regret and remorse for everything he had done, and he understood that his life was the most unbecoming lifestyle that a person can ever live. Says the Gemara, as a direct result of this emotional roller coaster, of this very passionate tshuva experience that he went through, the Gemara tells us that Elazar ben Dordaya actually lost his life because he was so overwhelmed by this incredible experience that he was having at that time. And immediately following his death, the Gemara tells us that a baskol came out, a heavenly voice came out from Shamayim and said, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya mazuman l'chayei ha'olam haba. Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya now is a Baal Tshuva, and he is going to be welcomed, he will be ushered into Olam Haba. His sincere tshuva had been accepted. Then the Gemara says, a strange anecdote, that upon hearing this baskol, upon hearing this heavenly voice call out, that Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya mazuman l'chayei olam haba, the Gemara says, Bacha Rebbe ve'amar. Rebbe begins to cry and he says, Yesh kona olama b'kama shanim. There are some people who are able to gain entry into Olam Haba throughout a process, throughout many years of working, v'yesh kona olama b'sha achas. And some people, look at that, they can have an ephemeral, a fleeting moment of tshuva, just a quick thought of tshuva, after living a whole life of immorality, of a low kind of existence, and yesh kona olama b'sha achas. Rabbi was marveling at this reality of tshuva. What an incredible gift that we can actually have the opportunity to gain entry into Olam Haba in the last second, after living a whole life that was not leading us toward Olam Haba. I once saw an insight of the Mizritcher Maggid, where the Mizritcher Maggid pointed out that if in fact Rebbe was so amazed by this reality that a person can gain entry into Olam Haba in one moment, in just one act, in the last moments of life, because of the power and the potency of tshuva, then asked him his Mizritcher Maggid, why is it that the Gemara says, Bacha Rebbe, what's he crying about? That's not a reason to cry. Is there any greater reason to be happy in our lives than to know this is the most unbelievably gratifying feeling we should have when we think about the fact that we're never lost, that we're never abandoned, that we're never neglected, that our Creator, that God Himself will always take us back even after we've given a whole life to Him that He didn't ask us to live. Even after we've upset Him so dearly and so deeply. Why, Bacha Rebbe? What's he crying about? He should be so overly joyed by this baskol. What's the Bacha Rebbe ve'amar? Explain the Mizritcher Maggid, yes, it's true that in the end, Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya procured himself entry into Olam Haba. That might be true. Yes, it's true that in the end he slips himself through the cracks and he gains entry. Just at the last minute before he leaves this earth, before he departs from his journey of life. Yes, it's true that he gained himself entry into Olam Haba. However, you know why Rebbe cried? Bacha Rebbe ve'amar, because when you think about it, a Jew might make his way into Olam Haba. But we cannot ignore the reality of the journey of life that this person has just lived. How pathetic that Elazar ben Dordaya's entire life was such a waste. That's what Rebbe's crying about. Rebbe understood that true reality, true vitality in this world is not about these quick fixes. It's not about saying Parshas Haman every day. It's not about the Parak Shira. It's not about the Kotel 40 days. It's not about paying someone to do something that's going to get us out of it. These quick fixes might actually get us into Olam Haba. Who knows? But that's not what our goal and our purpose actually is on this world. That's not what we're here for. The life of a Jew is not just about getting ourselves through the door. It's not just about procuring a path for ourselves into Olam Haba. It's about the daily challenges that we face, and it's about the decisions that we make when we are confronted with each and every one of them. Considering the life of Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, Rebbe is enough slightest understanding or appreciation for what the journey of life of a Jew is actually supposed to be. that it's about every day's decision. It's about the challenges that we face each and every moment that we are here. And this, said Rebbe, is the greatest tragedy I can imagine. Bacha Rebbe va'amar, yesh kono olama b'sha'a achas. How sad is it that there are people who think that life is only about that one moment of slipping themselves through the door. There's a story written about Rabbi Yashiv, and I read it in his biography, the Art Scroll biography that was printed, that he was once asked to serve as a sandik for a 6th generation grandchild that was born to him and his family. So he was filled with great emotion, and they had asked him that he should come to Bnei Brak to serve as the sandik later in the week, and Rabbi Yashiv profusely thanked his family for the great honor that they had bestowed upon him. But he then told them that for personal reasons he wouldn't be able to attend the bris and he would not be able to serve as the sandik. Rather surprised by Rabbi Yashiv's refusal, what a great opportunity to be a sandik at a 6th generation bris, so the grandchildren are all talking about it. Can you imagine? We offered Zaidi, Rabbi Yashiv, to be the sandik and he's not even coming. So finally one of the grandchildren courageously brought himself to Rabbi Yashiv and asked him, don't you know, Zaidi, that the Mekubalim say that if you serve as a sandik by a 6th generation grandchild, you get ushered directly into Olam Haba? So don't you know that? Don't you want to have that opportunity? And now we're offering it to you, and you're turning us down? Do you understand what a rare opportunity this is? Who knows if you'll have another chance to do this? And how many people are there in the world that even can think about having such a chance, who can live so long, who have grandchildren who are healthy, who have grandparents who are healthy enough to do such a thing? How can you say no to such a thing? Rabbi Yashiv, they write without missing a beat, at 98 years old, responded, my plan is to access and enter Olam Haba through the front door. I'm not walking in through the side entrances. I'm not interested. Such a powerful lesson that Rabbi Yashiv taught all of us, and it gives such a rich and deep understanding into the Mizricha Maggid's comment about Bacha Rebbe Va'amar. This is the life of Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya that is so pathetic. Yes, the potency of tshuva is incredible. Yes, we can turn ourselves around and in the last minute we can figure out how to slip ourselves through the door. But can you imagine the wasted life? Is this what Rabbi Yashiv's life is all about? Just being a sandik for a 6th generation grandchild? That's what life is? He knew what life was all about. He knew that life was so much more important than just that skula or just that little quick fix. Life was about every single decision that he decided to make throughout his over 100 years living on this earth and giving to the Jewish people. The issue with all these quick fixes is not that they don't work, but that we dangle ourselves on them and then we forget that they don't really make an impact on the rest of the day that we confront. We might say all these different tefillos, we might do all these different things, but our Judaism cannot stop there. Our Judaism is so much more rich than that. We have an entire life of mitzvahs to accomplish. We have intricate halachas that are made to be kept, and we have an entire Torah that we are expected to master. And if we can't do that, we are like that person that the Chidah describes, who doesn't even have a heartbeat, who's suffocating, who doesn't even have a pulsating heart inside of them. And what good are all these little things if we can't understand the value of the life? Yes, but our lives are so much richer than that. And it's not just about slipping through the cracks and getting through in a side door. In yesterday's Parshas Vayelech, we read, V'anochi haster aster panai bayom hahu, which is talking about a description of the hester panim. The Ribono Shel Olam will not show his face to us as he did in previous generations. Care about us. You have people who have some, and they think that they have no relation. Tragedy than the person who thinks that God doesn't care about them. Even worse than that, suggests that Baal Shem Tov is the person that lives in a generation when God hides the very fact that he is distant and removed from us. The person who lives in a generation and a time where we go about life thinking that our relationship with God is fine, that we've made it, that we're okay. And we're distantly removed. We are so Ribono Shel Olam himself to be connected with him anymore. That's hostile. We don't even understand what a relationship is supposed to be. We know what it means to be close. The pasuk in Parshas Va'eschanan writes, "Uvikashta misham es Hashem Elokecha, umatzasa kisid rishena." When you search out God and you look for Him, you're trying to figure out, where am I going to get Him? Umatzasa kisid rishena v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. One of the Svarim writes a beautiful interpretation that there are people who search out Avikashta Misham. They go on a journey and they look for God and they try to figure out, maybe He's going to be over there. Uvikashta Misham, then they look, maybe He's going to be over there, and maybe I'll do this thing. Maybe I'll do that skula. Maybe I'll do this special thing. And maybe that's going to figure out how to give me a relationship with God. And what they forget is, Umatsasa, the bottom line is, you want to find Him? Where are you going to find Him? Kisid Rishenu b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. We don't have to go too far. Our relationship with God is right inside of every one of us. And it's not somewhere that we need to go l'sham or l'sham. We don't have to go anywhere else. We just have to look deep inside our core essence and understand that God is living, is resting inside of each and every one of us. Neshama tahora shenasatabi. The Ribono Shel Olam gives us a piece of Him. And He wants to be a part of us. He's right here. And we don't have to go any distance to find Him. The Medrash writes in yesterday's parsha, an unbelievable mashal, unbelievable story. Maisa b'sfina achas. The Medrash tells us there's a story that's told about a boat that was traveling to some community. Shahaisa kula shal nachem. The entire boat was filled with non-Jews. V'haya b'tocha Yehudi echad. Says the Medrash, there was one Yehudi, there was one Jew who was found on this boat amongst all the non-Jews. I would imagine hundreds of people on the boat, a big cruise liner ship, and there's one Jew amongst all the non-Jews. Higiu l'namal echad. They finally get to some resting point, to some dock. Amr lo osi Yehudi. So they single out the one Jew who's there in the crowd on the boat, and they all collect money, and they say to him, Tal Mos, take all of our collective money, Va'alei l'namal, and we want you, we designate you to go up onto the deck, onto the dock, and figure out, Kach lanu misham me'uma. Why don't you go shopping for us? You know, we're running out of food on the boat. Do us a favor. We all give you money. Don't spend your own money. Take our money and go up into this new town that we've just docked at and go figure out where the marketplace is and go figure out how to buy us food with the money that we've given you. Amar lahem. So the Jew turns to them and he says, I don't understand. Lo achsanayani ve'eni makir lehechan elech. The same way that you are not comfortable going up into this land and finding where the marketplace is, you have no idea where you are. Don't you understand that I'm also a guest here? Don't you understand that as much as you are uncomfortable going, I'm also? I don't know where I'm going. I'm lost. So why are you sending me? Why don't one of you go? Or I'm happy to go with somebody else. Amru lo. Listen to this. So they respond to him. Yesh Yehudi achsanoi. Is there such a thing as a Jew who's lost? Is there such a thing as a Jew who's alone, who's a stranger? B'chol makom she'ata holech Elokecha imach. Is there such a thing as a Yehudi? The non-Jews sometimes recognize fixes. They're not the skulas. It's not the flipping of the pages on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It's not the banging of our chests. These are all the minor bandages to the gravely wounded patient who is ourselves. These are all. Our first order is to recommit ourselves to Taraseinu HaKdosha, to redirect our attention and our energies to the strict observance and adherence to every single one of the Taryag mitzvahs, ki hu chayechem ve'orech yamechem. That ultimately is what will give us life, and that's what will give us our true essence and meaning. Let's remember that although we always advocate and we always try to invoke our schusavos, and we say it in the slichos, zechar lanu schusavos, we always ask that the Ribono Shel Olam remember Just like the Klal Yisrael's Nimshalu Legefen, that lives off of a lifeless stick, we ask that he always remember our schusavos, and that they stand up, that they uphold our generation. But at the same time, our job, even though we invoke our schusavos, our job is never to measure ourselves up to their achievements or to their standards. The same way Mishana Zu Al Shel Chaverta would invalidate an entire count for Meiser, so too we don't have that right to consider ourselves like the previous generations, because they're not living the lives that we do, and they did not live the lives that we do. And let us always consider the fact that we never need to go far distances. We never need to go anywhere else. Misham, umisham. We never need to look in other places to connect and to find our place with the Ribono Shel Olam. We might wander and we might search, or bikashta misham. Sometimes in life, we look in all sorts of directions to figure out this method or that obscure approach to try to figure out how to connect ourselves. But in the end, umatzasa kisid rishenu b'chal levavcha v'chal nafshecha. Ultimately, he can be found deep inside of our core essence, inside of each and every one of us, as long as we remember Asher lo Elokim krovim elav. Like the Medrash says, B'chal makom she'ata holech Elokecha imach. Your God is always with you. There's no such thing as a Yehudi achsanoi. There's no such thing as being alone. And there's no such thing as ever being abandoned or left by ourselves. B'chal makom she'ata holech Elokecha imach. I wish everyone a Gemar Chasima Tova, and thank you again for such a great opportunity.
Have a wonderful day. Gemar Chasima Tova, everybody.